Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church's Sermon Spotlight, where we take a deeper dive into the sermon each week, sharpening our minds with truth and encouraging one another in our daily Christian walk, all through the joys of conversation. I'm Rose Locke. I'm the host today, and joining me are Abby Linneberg. Hello, Abby.
Hi.
And Micah, who was able to share with us from the pulpit this past weekend. Just to give everyone who's listening some context, this sermon was part of our Following Jesus series. We're getting towards the end, and specifically, we were covering all of Mark chapter 15, which is a really big piece. I wanted to start today with something slightly different, an important part of the sermon, and I think Mike is going to talk about that a little bit to us here today. An important part was Psalm 22. So I just thought, as we're in Holy Week, looking forward to Good Friday and Easter, that we might just start by reading a piece of Psalm 22. So I'm just going to read. I'm reading from the Holman. It says, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far from my deliverance and from my words of groaning? My God, I cry by day and you do not answer, by night, yet I have no rest. But you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. Our ancestors trusted in you. They trusted and you rescued them. They cried to you and were set free. They trusted in you and were not disgraced. And then I'm going to jump to verse 27. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations will bow down before you. For kingship belongs to the Lord. He rules the nations. All who prosper on earth will eat and bow down. All those who go down to the dust will kneel before him. Even the one who cannot preserve his life, their descendants will serve him. The next generation will be told about the Lord. They will come and declare his righteousness to a people yet to be born. They will declare what he has done. Micah, you chose this psalm and you talked about the beginning and the end of the psalm and the references involved. So I'd really like to turn to you first, and maybe you want to expound a little bit on this psalm and why the psalm is so important when we're looking at the crucifixion of Christ.
Yeah, it's very significant. It's fulfilled all throughout Mark chapter 15. Several references. It's the words from Jesus's mouth on the cross. Have you forsaken me? And like I mentioned on Sunday and Saturday, that when Jesus quotes that line, like you said, Rose, that there's good reference to think, or good reason to think he's quoting the entire passage. He's got this forward thinking, and it's not just expressing his suffering, but he's got that whole psalm in mind. And I hadn't noticed this before or really understood this, so I think it's worth sharing that in the Hebrew Bible, many of the books of the Bible are titled after the first line in the book. So, for instance, we call it Genesis, but in the Hebrew Bible, it's called Bereshit, which is in the beginning. So it's called, that's the title. In Exodus, it's called Shemot, which is names. And that's the first line from the book of Exodus. So there's good reason when Jesus says the first line, he's got that whole psalm in view. And I love, Rose, that you read the last section, because we talked a lot about, what was being fulfilled at the cross, then Jesus' cry. But there's also more of this forward thinking. And those verses you read, 27 through 31, it talks about really what happens post-resurrection. When Jesus rises from the dead, the Great Commission, go into all the world and make disciples of all the nations. And that's what happens in verse 27. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations will worship before you. Yeah. So there's even this more forward thinking.
Yeah, and it's like inclusion, one of the things that we've seen, I think, in this book of Mark study is this turning from I'm offering the Messiah to the Jews.
Yeah.
And the Jews are rejecting me as Messiah. And so now I am offering the grafting in of the Gentiles, right? And there it is right there at the end of the psalm. Really amazing.
Yeah, and that starts with the centurion, right? There's this Gentile Roman proclaiming, yes, you are the Son of God. You're the Messiah. So just to that point, the beginning of going to the nations. And I love this connection as well. The very last line of Psalm 22 is, they will come and declare that he has performed it, or he has done it. And it seems to be an echo of another phrase Jesus said on the cross: it is finished. And that's what we're going to be proclaiming for eternity, that Jesus has done it, that it's finished. And I just think that there's such a wealth of connection between Psalm 22, the cross, and then even beyond. So it's just such an amazing passage just to sit in and reflect on.
Yeah. Well, and you brought up that like Mark was making a lot of connections like that. He was very intentional with his words, like using Son of God was a reference to Old Testament messianic like titles. And I just kind of made me think, I feel like we've said a lot that Mark is very brief and Mark focuses on action and all these things, but to me this week it stood out that he's also very intentional.
Yeah.
And he's like, it's well thought out. It's meticulous, that this connects to this and this connects to this, and pay attention because it all, like you said, points to the cross.
Yeah.
Well, and just Micah, like the inclusio, like let's talk about that intent. That when Micah, you were discussing how intentional Mark is, it was when you were talking about that there's an inclusio.
Yeah.
And do you want to explain to the people who are listening who might not have caught what an inclusio is?
Yeah. An inclusio, it's a literary device or something an author can use to signal meaning. So like what you were saying, Abby, it's really important that anytime you open a book and you're thinking about, okay, the author wrote this for a specific purpose, we always got to remember everything that's put in and everything that's left out is intentional. There's no word that's just filler. So everything is intentional, and that's because it's inspired by the Holy Spirit.
So can I don't know. I'm just going to reach in and make it a little practical for people. So it's like when you're in school and you're learning how to write a 5-paragraph essay, right? And you learn, okay, here's your thesis statement. And then in the first paragraph, you have an introduction and a thesis statement, what you're going to say. And then you have your 3 paragraphs of what you're going to say. And then you have that last paragraph where you are supposed to, or at least what I learned, you're supposed to restate that thesis statement in other words, and then make it applicable to people's lives, right? And so these authors are doing nothing different than what we learn in our, English 101 class. Just longer than 5 paragraphs. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. I totally agree. And that shows up with the inclusio there in Mark 1 and Mark 15. And it's so intentional because I think I mentioned this in one of the services, but when you go to the baptism in Matthew's account and Luke's account, Matthew and Luke use a different word. It's the typical word for open, but Mark uses the word torn. And he's intentional with that word at the beginning because he's going to use it for the veil with the dual declaration of the Son of God. And it's like he's trying with all the means he can use, because he's not there when we're reading the letter and he can't be like tapping you on the shoulder, look at this.
Yeah.
But he uses other means, repetition, his purpose statement, and this inclusio to kind of grab our head and be like, are you seeing this? Are you trying to, are you focusing on what the main point is?
I just think that's really cool. Cause I don't know, probably people that are listening, and probably both of you, you guys have written an essay, or you've taken the time to put together some kind of documentation. And in that documentation, you might come to the end. My experience has been, I might come to the end and I might use a word at the end of what I've written. And I might go, oh, if I use that word at the beginning, now I'm going to give people this inclusio. And I think we need to be aware that Mark is an artist who's inspired by the Holy Spirit. So with that phrase in mind, that in the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he himself, as he's writing, he is probably uncovering and becoming aware of these concepts as well. Oh, I saw heaven tear open. I saw the veil torn. Because I have a feeling, when he first wrote, the beginning, maybe he hadn't seen the veil torn open, or maybe when he saw the veil torn open, that made him make the connection himself that, heaven was torn open for us. It's kind of a cool
and
thing.
I think this is a disadvantage that we have of our modern services, is that often the Gospel of Mark was intended to be read out loud in one sitting to the group over and over again. So you would hear the beginning and the end in one sitting typically. But here, it's taken us over a year to go through it. So we forget what came in chapter 1.
Yeah.
But it's really important that we continually read books as one unit and see those connections. And then even just the benefit of reading it out loud is helpful.
Yeah. So Abby, is there anything like that stood out to you in the course of the sermon that you wanted to have a chance to ask Micah about? Or
Yeah.
Go for it.
Well, first off, I feel like I've never seen you that emotional, like on stage. And there was like a lot of like inflection in your voice, and even like you yelling. I was like, wow, I've never heard you yell before. But I thought it was so powerful and like so meaningful to this message specifically. Like it kind of set the tone.
Yeah.
Because I mean, we had the kids in service, and sometimes when the kids are there, it feels like a little lighter, a little more fun. And then you really you brought it back down, but in a good way. I felt like it was like it kind of hit. Like, oh, we're going into Holy Week, and this is what that means.
Yeah. Well, it was definitely a very emotional passage to preach.
Yeah.
And there were times when I was like, all right, you can get through this. Like there were moments where it's just like the text was just hitting me with the significance of what's going on here.
Yeah.
Well, I know I'm an emotional person. I'm a passionate person. You don't see me cry too often, but I have to admit that like when we got to the parts, Micah, where you were describing crucifixion, and it's not as if this is the first time I've heard crucifixion described before,
right?
But I have to admit, I listened 3 times and I got emotional as I listened all 3 times, Micah. So
it felt intense, like in a way that I think we needed. I think sometimes we can brush over the Easter story, like we know he died for us. But one thing that kind of stuck out to me was like he didn't just die, he suffered. He like chose to suffer for us, and he suffered for a while. And it's like he could have died quickly. That could have been part of God's plan, or he could have been murdered or something in the streets, or because people were so angry at him. But like he chose suffering and death for us, and I thought that like really stood out to me this weekend anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that suffering, First Peter talks about this. He did it to set an example for us. To be a faithful, merciful high priest. He can understand the pain that we're going through. So sure, he's accomplishing our greatest need. We can't minimize that in his death and resurrection, but also the whole process of him living his whole life, and then those hours there going through that. He can sympathize, when we're in pain, when we're suffering, and when we're mocked, when we're rejected, when we're misunderstood, all these things. So now, as our advocate, he understands and he can sympathize with us.
Well, and I think one of the things, Micah, that stuck out to me that I had never really considered or thought about before was this idea that he took on himself what Barabbas deserved. And so this idea, you just kind of glossed over it really quickly, but this idea that Barabbas kind of is a picture of the replacement.
Mm-hmm.
Barabbas is a picture of us and Christ in his replacement. I thought that was really intriguing. So I wondered if you could expand upon that more, if you had more thoughts on that,
Well, I first heard that idea from, I don't know who did it, but I think it was a pastor or a teacher talking about just how he was bringing out the fact that we can see ourselves in Barabbas, and just the idea of Jesus dying in our place. And we really are just as guilty as Barabbas. But we also have just this really interesting contrast when you think about the two. Like here's an insurrectionist, one who is fighting against the authority. But we have Jesus here submitting to that earthly authority and their rule, but also he's the king. So he came with a kingdom to establish, and Barabbas is trying to tear down a kingdom.
And there's nothing. Why should Christ submit to that earthly authority except for Philippians, right?
Yeah. And then another contrast is Barabbas is said to be a murderer. So you have the murderer, but then you have the one who came to give life. So you have one who's taken life. Jesus came to give life. And another contrast is that Barabbas seems to be the ringleader. He most likely should have been on that middle cross. And Jesus not only took the death sentence, but he literally took that middle cross where Barabbas should have been. So maybe those two guys are insulting Jesus because they're like, why did Barabbas, our buddy that we followed, how did he get to go free? So you have Barabbas, someone who leads people to death, and Jesus, someone who leads people into freedom and life. So there's this contrast. And then something that I hadn't noticed before is the names. So there's really good reason to think that Barabbas, his first name is actually Jesus. So if you read some translations, for example, the NET in Matthew, they'll call it out, Jesus Barabbas.
NET, can you give us context for what does NET stand for?
New English Translation.
Okay, thank you.
So when you read Matthew 27, there's a text, I believe it's called the Caesarean text. They include Jesus Barabbas. So it's what's called a textual variant. So some agree, some don't. But there is good reason to think that his name is actually Barabbas, not only because of manuscripts that include it, but in Matthew 27, Pilate, he clarifies. He says, who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ? So there would be no reason to clarify what Jesus they're talking about unless it was, do you want to release for me Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who's called the Messiah? So you got two guys here, most likely have the same name, Jesus and Jesus.
And interesting, like I had just till you're speaking now, I'm just observing. He didn't call him Jesus of Nazareth, did he?
Right. Yeah. Jesus who's called the Christ. Yeah. Which is a title. And that is also what Barabbas is. So Barabbas is, it's an Aramaic term that means son. So bar, and then Abba, Abbas is father. So same word, in Galatians or Romans, we can cry out, Abba, Father. So you got Jesus, son of the Father, and then you have Jesus, son of the Father. So two guys, same first name and also same title, if you put it, but total opposites. One guilty, one innocent, and all the other things I explained. So it's just really interesting. It's just like, wow, two guys here, so different, but they share similar names. And it just, again, goes back to, we can easily see ourselves in being Barabbas. We're so guilty of that, but he gets set free.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about with that too is more like from the crowd perspective. I feel like I always kind of put myself in the shoes of the people in the crowd. And like from here, it's easy to think that like, oh, I wouldn't have chosen the murderer over Jesus. I would have, whatever. Yeah. But I think it also kind of symbolizes like that we often choose sin over righteousness. Like our flesh can get the better of us in that situation. Like it got the better of them. They were convinced by the religious leaders to choose the wrong choice, really. Yeah. And so I just thought that was like another interesting symbolism on top of all of the symbolism.
This was not in the text that you covered, but it speaks to the point that you're making, Abby. And that is this idea, like sometimes we give Peter a really hard time, right? For the denial. And now we give the crowd a hard time for being fickle. But especially in this context, Peter in the denial, and then us, Barabbas kind of being a representation of us or putting ourselves in the place of Barabbas. I think that it is so easy for our flesh to just come out on a whim. Peter did not desire to deny Christ. In fact, Peter claimed that he would never do that. And then here he is in the moment, walking in his flesh and not keeping his focus on who Christ is or the Holy Spirit, all those things. So I think that it is wrong of us to give those people such a hard time, because I think that more often than not, we walk in those ways. The flesh comes out when we should be focusing on the Spirit and
right.
keeping our eyes, following Jesus, fixing our eyes on the author and perfecter of our faith. So,
you mentioned the mockery, and I had a question around that. You talked about how like a lot of the things that they said were actually true. Is there a significance to that?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that too. Like, we know one of Jesus' statements, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. So I wonder if that fits into some of the mockery. You know, they're not really understanding exactly what's going on. But I think it just goes to the fact that humanity can be so deceived or so blind to what's happening in front of them that they're either so self-absorbed they're choosing to disregard it, or they just don't understand even though it's been revealed to them.
Yeah.
But I think the irony also highlights just the love that Jesus has. You know, he is the king. He is all these things that they're doing in mocking fashion. And in the service, we read Philippians 2. There will be a day when every knee will bow. So those soldiers who did that in mocking fashion, one day they're going to stand before Jesus and they're going to bend the knee in reverence to Jesus. So it just highlights, I think, just his willingness to lay that all aside out of love to die for them. But it's definitely worth considering more, because I think there's a lot of richness to that idea there.
Yeah. And then I also was wondering about Elijah. They like mentioned like, oh, let's wait and see if Elijah's going to come down.
Yeah.
And I was wondering why that felt easier for them to accept rather than like Jesus being the Messiah, when all the signs were pointing to it.
Yeah.
They're like, yeah, Elijah, he might come down.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. And to be honest, I'm not sure the whole significance of that scene, but I do think that in their tradition, Elijah was someone who would come to the rescue of those who cried for help. So when Jesus is crying out in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, it sounds very similar to Elijah, Eli, Eli. So they probably thought, okay, what he's saying is similar to Elijah. And it's interesting, again, I think we have the final like nail in the coffin that they are so focused on their tradition rather than what Jesus came to do. So they're like, oh, our tradition says Elijah's going to come. This is amazing. Let's try to get him to call Elijah down. So they then give him this liquid. And at first when I would read that, I would think, oh, they're so nice. They're giving him some water or some liquid to drink. But it seems like it's actually more of a cruel thing to do, because what they're wanting to do is they're wanting Jesus to hang there even longer, to cry out even more, so that Elijah can come. So it's kind of like this game they're playing. Oh, let's see. And again, it's just the cruelty there on display, and they're focusing more on the tradition rather than what's happening right in front of them. Yeah.
I appreciate it very much, Micah. I'll just say that the references back to the suffering servant passage of Isaiah, I thought that continual continual reminder that here we have this Isaiah passage that is pointing towards this Redeemer who's going to come, this suffering servant who's going to come. And so not only do we see the prophecies fulfilled in Psalm 22, but we see those prophecies fulfilled from Isaiah 53 and how important and key that Isaiah passage is to understanding who Christ is and what he did on the cross. And that has actually come up, I've noticed, in many of the sermons in the last 3 to 4 weeks, is the connection between Mark and Isaiah. So do you have any insights as to why you think that connection is so present in the book of Mark when it's really written to Romans? Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
I have some thoughts. They might be underdeveloped or whatever, but some things that have stood out to me. So when you go to Mark 1, Mark presents his purpose statement. So we talked a little bit about this beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Then he says, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Mark is quoting from, he's actually quoting from Malachi and Isaiah, and he's kind of merging the two, but he gives credit to Isaiah. And he's quoting from Isaiah 40, which Isaiah 40 is the beginning, I believe, of this unit that includes the suffering servant passage. So the original audience would probably know, okay, this is like a whole unit that includes this passage. So from the very beginning, he's signaling, again, as an author, this is where I'm going. In his thesis statement, Rose, as you mentioned, this is where I'm going, the suffering servant. And he brings that all the way back in the end to that point. Mm-hmm. And we don't really get to that suffering servant part until he comes and offers the kingdom and is rejected. And then there's this turning beginning in chapter 8 where he starts the first of 3 declarations. I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to die. I'm going to rise again. So the reason I think it's come up so much more is, okay, now it's being fulfilled. But to go back to your original question, I think we see that more in Mark because Mark is intending us to see that from the beginning. He's pointing us towards, I want you to see that Jesus is the mighty Messiah and the suffering servant.
This is just a curious question. I mean, I understand for us spiritually today why that's important and how that's helpful to us as we understand the whole picture of God. But I'm wondering if you know, or is there any evidence that Isaiah would have been more present for the Romans in some way, or that because we've established that this was written to Romans, right? And the importance of the Roman soldier declaration at the end that you brought out. Do you know the answer to that question? I'm literally just curious.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I'm sure there's more to it, but it does seem like Mark is wanting to highlight the suffering servant, that's who Jesus is, and we can follow him because the Roman church there was experiencing intense suffering. And they're going through this, and what an encouragement it would be to be reminded, Jesus has done this. Jesus was the firstborn of the brethren who rose from the dead. He conquered sin and death, and he suffered, and we get to follow him to victory, even though right now, for a short time, we're suffering. And I think that would really grip their hearts and be very encouraging for them. And the same is true for us, right? Like, we may not be experiencing the same type of suffering, but we experience suffering in all of its forms, whether it's just suffering from sin, suffering from health, or family, rejections, relationships, whatever it might be, we also go through that. And Mark is just as relevant for us as it was for that early church, that Jesus went before us, Jesus suffered, and he showed us how to suffer well. And I think at the cross, it fully displays that. He submitted to the plan of the Father, which included suffering. He looked to the future as well, and he had confidence even in that moment and peace in that moment. And the same is available for us. We don't have to fight against suffering. We can actually go through it just like Jesus did, and in a sense, embrace it with a confident trust in God.
And in the future, which is what the end of Psalm 22, right, brings us to, which is what you said in your sermon. So I feel like that brings us full circle a little bit. Abby, did you have any other thoughts or questions for Micah? Great. And Micah, I'll let you have the final word here on the on what we just talked about. Do you have anything else you want to share with the audience?
Well, I just think that we can't reflect on this passage enough. Like, it has been such a blessing for me to, in a sense, and I've gladly been able to step into this, but to be forced to spend time in this, like, or I've been given the gift to spend time in this passage. And it's been such a blessing for me over the last month or so, just to kind of sit in here and reflect on this. And I think we can't do this enough. And I guess I'll end with one of my favorite verses in 2 Peter. 2 Peter, in chapter 1, he's exhorting these believers to progress in maturity. And one of the reasons he says we don't progress in maturity is because of this. He says, "For he who lacks these qualities is blind or short-sighted, having forgotten his purification from his former sins." So So there's something about us continually having what Jesus did on the cross in front of us that draws us closer to the Lord and progresses us to maturity. So we can never forget what Jesus did there on the cross.
Yeah. And I'll just use that as a transition into just a couple of things. I think I had the gift. You had the gift to spend time in this passage. I had the gift to spend a lot of time in the song, His Mercy is More. And the importance of the cross and the atonement and the sacrificial lamb in the forgiveness of our sins and the mercy that God showed has just been a really spiritually impactful thing for me to get to spend time in. And so I just want to encourage people that in the Home Center is the Song Spotlight resource related to His Mercy is More, and spending time in that as you contemplate the cross can just be a really powerful spiritual tool. Mm-hmm. And along with that, the reason I really wanted to ask you about the suffering servant passages is because I've also had the opportunity to help craft with the worship planning team the Good Friday service that's coming this Friday. And the suffering servant, Isaiah 53, is kind of a key component of that service. So I just want to encourage people, if you found Micah's sermon as moving as both Abby and I did, that Good Friday is just going to really follow on the heels of that beautifully. And I'll just say God has that planned, because it's not like we had a conversation with Micah 6 weeks ago. Micah, exactly what's your sermon going to include and entail? So God has just done a really cool thing with the way Good Friday is going to impact that. I'm going to ask Abby, she's on the communications team, to finish our announcements, but I'll do Good Friday real quick first and then pass the rest to you. So on Friday, we're going to have 2 services at 4:00 and 7. If you have preschoolers and nursery children that you want to have cared for and not in the service, 4:00 is your time. 4:00 will also be live streamed, but then available to watch from then on. So I just really want to encourage folks. Good Friday service is not usually one of the most highly attended of our worship services throughout the year. I just want to help people understand that there's going to be a lot of cool value there. We are doing a Tenebrae service where we're going to ask people to leave in silence. So it's slightly different than some of the other services we've done. So just give everybody a heads up. Abby, share with us what else is going on.
Well, that really sets the tone for the weekend then. And over the weekend, we'll have Easter services, which we've added a service on Sunday. So there's still FSAT at 5 p.m., but then on Sunday there's 8, 9:30, and 11. And then there's kids services at 9:30 and 11. So similar to normal, but and then there's still F3 downstairs at 11. So all the options, just some extra options for you. And then the one other thing that I wanted to point out was the membership class, which is the following Friday. Which if you don't know about membership, at fellowship, membership means like growing together in Christ, serving with one another, walking side by side through every season of life. A lot of what all of us are already doing. But if you're ready to make that meaningful commitment, then I would encourage you to attend the membership class on Friday from 6:30 to 9:30.
Okay, awesome. So the Easter services are just an hour long. I'll share that. So I'll also share that 9:30 is pretty heavily attended. And the numbers of people attending our church have been growing. And so we are expecting for there to be some crowds. So if you want to avoid crowds, you might consider 8 or 11 on Sunday. So that's where we are. And I just want to tell you that we're thankful for all of you who are listening and becoming part of the conversation. And you can become even a more important or involved part of the conversation if you have questions and you share them with us on the website. We like to hear from you guys, and we like to address the things in this podcast that you want to have addressed. So remember that sermons aren't just heard, they're lived.